Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 9th of February. Today we are looking at the story of Genesis 27. It's that time of Isaac's life as he approaches his death. He has gone blind, a fairly common occurrence amongst elderly folks, certainly in those times. And he is wanting to bestow his blessing on his firstborn. Primogeniture, that is the standard practice of the time, and even to this day we see it taking place. And so Isaac calls in his firstborn. Remember, they had twins, he and Rebekah, twins, and the first to come out was Esau, a very hairy man. The description of just how hairy later is quite terrifying, and followed immediately by his twin brother Jacob, who is a play on the word deceit or deceitfulness. And Jacob is depicted as coming out of the womb clutching onto his brother Esau's ankle, which is a play on words, because that in those ancient times, to tap someone on the ankle was seen, or to grab someone's ankle was seen to as a way of tripping them up, obviously, but also of exercising deceit over their life. So Isaac, kind of on his deathbed, blind, calls in Esau and says, please go and hunt for me some game and prepare my favorite food, and I will then bestow my blessing on you. The way of doing an oral blessing on your deathbed is, again, a very accepted pattern in those days. Now we tend to do it in writing and not oral. But Rebekah is listening. She's eavesdropping, in other words, and she hears what is going on. She sees Esau go off. She knows that a hunt is going to be a fairly lengthy affair, and it would probably only be much later in the day that he returns with some wild game. So she then immediately calls Jacob. She concocts a plan, and she says, go and quickly slaughter some 2 young goats and dress up in the skins of the goats. You can imagine those skins must be rather wet, certainly very smelly and very hairy, and I'm going to cook your father's favorite meal. And Jacob goes along with this. He's a little perturbed that if he gets caught, he'll bring down a curse upon his own head rather than a blessing. And so Rebekah says, do not worry, you'll wear your brother's clothing, I'll wrap your wrists and the back of your neck in the goat hair, and your father won't know the difference. And he will give you his blessing as if you were the firstborn. And once the blessing is given, the fact that it was intended for the firstborn and didn't get there, in our days we might say, well, it wasn't then an accurate meeting of the minds, so the contract is false. In those days, once the blessing is spoken, that's it. It cannot be retracted. So this is what Jacob and Rebekah do. Esau is still out in the bush, in the veld, hunting. And so Jacob then comes in with the prepared meal, dressed in his brother's clothing and covered in this hairy goat skin. And his dad's immediately suspicious. Isaac is immediately suspicious. And you see that he remains suspicious throughout, but he is unable to catch what is happening here. So he just makes, understandably so, the assumption that this is that this really is Esau. And he eats, he has some wine, he's happy and relaxed, albeit a little suspicious. And then he says, let me touch you. And he touches the back of Jacob's neck, and it's hairy. Imagine if Esau really was as hairy as a goat. And he touches his wrists, and it's hairy, just like Isaac would have anticipated Esau had been. He asks who he thinks is Esau, Jacob, to kiss him. And as Jacob leans forward to do that, he smells the smell of Esau in the clothes that Jacob is wearing. And so he bestows the blessing. And we would think this is really quite a terrible story. I mean, this is something wrong. And in every respect, it is wrong. This is a terrible story. And yet in an incredible way, and I cannot explain it clearly, but in an incredible way, this is what God had actually implied in his message to Rebekah all those many years before, when she was pregnant and she could feel these twins or babies in her tummy jumping and pushing and jostling. And she goes to the Lord to say, this is surely not right. And he says to you, you have twins, you have effectively two nations. But the second born will rule over the firstborn. Now, I'm not saying, as I try and explain this, that God resorts to deceitfulness. We're not saying that. But what we are seeing is that God perhaps will push through with his plans, even though as humans we are filled with our own faults and foibles. So God does not condone it, I believe, but God knew somehow it was going to happen, and he would work with it. Interestingly, Isaac and Jacob do not appear in Scripture as the greatest of people, and you do not get to read very much about them, except that they can do some terrible things. It's those that come after that have more written words given to them. So perhaps there's a judgment from God that I will work with you, but you do not fully satisfy my requirements. The other takeaway, and let me end with this, is that Rebekah certainly had a favorite in her family. Amongst her two sons, Jacob was her favorite. And having a favorite and making that absolutely known to the rest of the children is a very terrible thing to do. You see Jacob doing it later, where he has his favorite, which is Joseph, and perhaps to a lesser extent Benjamin. But certainly Joseph, who gets that fancy coat of many colors, it causes chaos in the family. So a lesson is, do not have favorites. Our children will all be different from one another, but they'll all be special, and they need to be loved equally. So folks, there's the story. No clear description of why God works with this, except God did. It was part of his plan. Not because he condones it, but because, I don't know, maybe you can tell me. Folks, have a wonderful day. We'll chat again tomorrow. God bless.